Dear Lord, may the words of my mouth, the meditations of our hearts, be pleasing in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Well, today we're going to be looking at Islam. And as we've been doing for the past few weeks, we're going to compare what followers of this religion believe as comparing it to what we believe as Christians. And just to clear up any confusion as we start, the religion is called Islam. Its followers are called Muslims. So let's start with the history of the religion. Islam originated in what is now called Saudi Arabia. From there, it expanded along the trade routes to Africa and Asia. And the man who started the religion was named Muhammad. And he was born in Arabia in the city of Mecca. He was born in 570 AD, so about 570 years after the birth of Jesus Christ. And he came from a very prominent family, but his dad died a few days before his own birth. Well, eventually his mother died, and Muhammad went to live with his grandfather. And once he died, he went to live with his uncle. And his uncle was a tradesman. He traveled as a merchant in the caravan trade. And so Muhammad joined him, and he traveled quite a bit. And they believed that it was through his travels that Muhammad developed his theory of monotheism, which means one God. And many times, or at that time, most people worshipped more than one God. But it's believed that Muhammad studied a lot of the scholars of the day, and including the Jewish Talmud. And he came to the conclusion that there was one God and only one God. Now it's interesting to note that there are no records that Muhammad studied with anyone who was familiar with the Bible. But he does, in the Quran, which I'll talk more about in a bit, he includes some biblical events. But his views and his theology of those particular events are really inaccurate. They're very flawed. And again, I'll talk about the Quran in just a bit. But while he was working in the caravan trade, Muhammad met a very wealthy woman named, she was a widow, she was named Khadijah. She was 15 years older than he was, but eventually they married and they had children. And over the next 15 years or so, Muhammad spent a great deal of his time in solitary meditation. And at the age of 40, he had his first revelation while he was on a mountain near Mecca. You remember the Angel Gabriel that we hear about in our Bible? Gabriel was the one who appeared to Zacharias, and he appeared to Mary to foretell the coming of Jesus Christ. But according to Muhammad, Gabriel, and it's the same Gabriel we hear about, appeared to him during a dream. And he brought him a direct command from God. And this is a quote. I'm going to read this to you, and I don't worry about trying to understand it. It doesn't make a lot of sense. But this is the quote. This is what Muhammad said Gabriel said to him. He said, "Read in the name of thy Lord who created man of coagulated blood. Read, thy Lord is the most beneficent, who taught by the pen, taught that what they knew not unto men." Again, very confusing, right? I don't really understand what that's saying. But in any case, it was from that command to read that the holy book of Islam got its name. The name of the book is Quran, and it means the reciting or the reading. And because Muhammad never learned to read or write himself, he recited all of his revelations to someone else to write down for him. So after his first revelation, Muhammad told his wife that he thought he was possessed. He didn't really understand what was going on. But his wife and her cousin encouraged Muhammad to speak the truth about his revelations, so he began to preach in the streets and the marketplaces of Mecca. And he never claimed to be divine, but he claimed that God, who in Islam is called Allah, had called him to be a prophet. Now, Muhammad hated the idolatry and the immorality of the Arab people who lived in Mecca and who visited in the marketplace there. And the people he thought were greedy, and they were very selfish. They even practiced infanticide. And so many people were opposed to Muhammad's message as he told them not to do those things. And so they sometimes went after him to try and hurt him or kill him even. But his uncle generally managed to keep him safe. But in 620 AD, though, both his uncle and his wife died. And the people then who opposed Muhammad made plans to kill him and his followers, knowing he really didn't have any more protection. And so he was forced to leave Mecca and flee to a city called Yathrib, which was a friendlier city to the north of Mecca. Now, Muhammad's flight from Mecca is called the Hijra, and it marks the beginning of the Islamic calendar. And you know, as we look at the Christian calendar, starting with the year Anno Domini, the year of the Lord, meaning the year that Christ was born. But Muslims count their year starting with Muhammad's flight from Mecca. They use the letters AH. We use AD. They call it the year of the Hijra. And he quickly became a political and religious leader in Yathrib. Eventually, the name of the city was changed to Medina in honor of him. And the name means the city of the prophet. Now, the people of Mecca were still angry with Muhammad, and they organized an army to go and kill him. And the fighting ended in 630 when Muhammad and his own army entered Mecca and destroyed every idol that was in the Kaaba, or the main temple. But they kept one particular stone called the Black Stone. It was a meteorite, a piece of meteorite. And then he claimed that Kaaba to be the most holy Islamic shrine. And to this day, no matter where Muslims are on the face of the earth, whenever they pray in the direction pointing toward that shrine. Now, over the next 2 years as a leading prophet and ruler of Arabia, Muhammad gained more followers and united the troops into these vast armies to conquer the world for Allah. And even after he died in 632, his followers continued to carry his message throughout Asia, Africa, and eventually into Europe. And they've done a really good job. Today, Islam is the second largest religion in the world. Christianity, of course, is the first. But it's estimated that there are 1.9 billion Muslims throughout the world, which works out to be about 25% of the world's population. About 49 countries have a Muslim majority, although Africa is the only continent with a Muslim majority. And most of the world's Muslim population lives in Southeast Asia, particularly in the countries of Indonesia, Pakistan, and India. And it's estimated, though, there are about 3 to 4 million Muslims in the United States. You may know that the Toledo area has a large Islamic population. You may have seen the Islamic Center of Greater Toledo. It's a mosque. It's located in Perrysburg. You can see it as you go around the expressway there. It's said that this is one of the most beautiful mosques in the country. There's also, in fact, they just opened a new branch of it, if you will, in Holland, and it's the big sign that says it's the Islamic Center. But there's also an Islamic Academy for grades K through 12 in Toledo. That's the first Islamic school in the state of Ohio. And you may know that Dearborn, Michigan has a huge Islamic or Muslim population. Almost half of the city's residents are Muslims. So let's look at some of the specifics of the tradition, how their beliefs compare to what we believe as Christians. So first of all, as I mentioned earlier, the holy book of Islam is called the Quran. And the Quran contains 140 surahs, or chapters. And Muhammad dictated some of this to scribes. Other parts came from his disciples who transcribed them from his oral teachings after he had died. They believe, though, the Muslims believe that this book was copied from original writings of Muhammad, but those writings itself, those original ones, are now in heaven. In addition to the Quran, Muhammad developed other teachings and sayings called the Sunnah, which literally means the path. So these teachings were organized into another book called the Hajj, which supplements the Quran. It's a supplemental book. There's also the Sharia. We're going to get into that in just a bit. But that contains the legal interpretations of the Quran and the Sunnah. And the word Sharia actually means law. And this work lays down the very strict code of contact for Muhammad's followers. And I'll cover that again in just a few minutes. But there are 6 basic beliefs that every Muslim is required to believe. And the first is that there is only one God, who is named Allah. Muslims believe that Allah is all-knowing, all-seeing, all-powerful, in the same way that we believe our God is. The second is a belief in angels. So Gabriel is the chief angel because it's said that he appeared to Muhammad. There's also a fallen angel called Shaitan, along with his followers who are demons. Muslims believe in 4 God-inspired books, the Torah of Moses, which we call the Pentateuch, first 5 books of the Bible. They believe in the Zabur, or the Psalms of David. They believe in the Angel, or the Gospel of Jesus, and they believe again in the Quran. And it's interesting to note that they follow some of the same scriptures that we follow, but there's a catch. They believe that the Jews and the Christians corrupted our scriptures, the original scriptures, so they believe that the Quran is God's final word to mankind, and that it supersedes all other previous writings. Now the Quran itself lists 28 prophets of Allah. And again, it's interesting to note that some of these are the same ones we consider prophets: Adam, Noah, Abraham, Moses, David, Jonah, and even Jesus. But they again believe that Muhammad is the latest and greatest prophet of God. They believe that on the last day of the world, the dead will be resurrected in order to be judged by Allah. And depending on what the person did during his or her life, he or she will be sent to heaven or to hell. And heaven is a place of great pleasure, while hell is a place for those who oppose Allah and his prophet Muhammad. The final doctrine of Islam is that of predestination. They believe that God has already decided what's going to happen in the world, and no one can change what God has already decreed. So in other words, they don't believe in free will, but they believe that everything that a person does is done because God has already said it's going to happen. And they call that the doctrine of Kismet. In addition now to these 6 doctrines of the faith, there are 5 pillars of faith. Every believer is expected to follow these things. And the first is a statement of belief. Anyone who wants to become a Muslim must publicly repeat the Shahada, which says, "There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is the prophet of Allah." And know that I'm only repeating that to you. I'm not saying that I believe that, okay? I don't want it to be that I'm declaring that. They're also expected to pray 5 times a day, at daybreak, at noon, mid-afternoon, after sunset, and then late in the evening. And again, they must bow, and they must bow and kneel in a specific way, and they must be facing in the direction of Mecca. The next one is Muslim law requires every believer to get this 1/40th of their income to help support widows, orphans, and the sick. 1/40th. We consider tithing, a full tithe, to be 1/10. They say 1/40th. And the 4th pillar is the celebration of Ramadan. The 9th month of the Islamic calendar is called Ramadan. It's the highest of their holy seasons. This year it began on March 22nd, it ended April 21st. But during Ramadan, Muslims are required to fast for the entire month. The fast, though, is limited to daylight hours. So most people get up really early before daybreak. They eat breakfast, and then they can't eat during the day, but they'll eat late at night once the sun goes down. And during Ramadan, a follower cannot commit any unworthy acts, or the fast is considered to be worthless. And believers are encouraged to focus on reaching out and helping other people during the month, especially during that month. And finally, the other pillar of their faith is that all believers are required to make a pilgrimage to the holy city of Mecca at least once during their lifetime. And that pilgrimage is called the Hajj. A person may send a representative, though, in his or her place if the journey is too difficult. So that is an option for them. Now, they also have very strict requirements for its members to follow on how they live their lives. And again, these guidelines come from the Quran, from the Hadith, and from Muhammad himself. And women in particular have a number of rules they have to follow concerning their clothing and their behavior. And you've probably seen Muslim women with veils across their face. This comes from Muhammad himself, who said that women had to cover their entire bodies except for their hands. So women believe that they need to cover their heads and their faces as well. And believers are also required to wear loose clothing so that you can't discern any body parts under it, and it has to be thick enough you can't see through it. You also don't talk to someone eye to eye. We're big on, making eye contact with people, but Muslims do not want to look another person in the eye because they believe that it could incite someone to lustful or amorous looking and thinking. So don't look someone in the eye. They're very strict about how and when women can interact with men other than their husbands. A woman cannot visit alone with a man without their husband being present. They cannot accept gifts from any other men. Husbands have the right to restrict the times their wives leave the house, and they can restrict where they go. Basically, women aren't allowed to leave home without the husband's permission, although a man is required to be compassionate and not just, force his wife to stay home. In some communities, men are also allowed to take more than one wife. This is interesting. Men and women are prohibited from dancing because they believe that dancing leads to greater forms of evil. And they aren't allowed to use public bathhouses or swimming pools. Wealthy men are allowed to build swimming pools on their own property, and a man and a wife can be in the pool at the same time, but no other men can be present if the woman is there. There are some similarities, believe it or not. Followers of Islam trace their heritage, their ancestry, to Ishmael, who we know is the son of Abraham. Muslims beliefs about the nature of God, though, the resurrection of the body, a final judgment, are somewhat similar to our beliefs as well. They also are the only non-Christian tradition that makes it an article of faith to believe in Jesus Christ. And as one source said, no Muslim is a Muslim if he doesn't believe in Jesus. They believe that Jesus was one of the highest and mightiest messengers of Allah, and that he was born miraculously in the same way that we believe. But they believe that with God's permission, he gave life to the dead, that he healed the blind and those with leprosy, just like our Bible tells us. But there are a lot of major contradictions between what we believe and what they believe. For them, there's one God and only one God. And they disagree with our doctrine that God is a Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And they say that anyone who believes in the Trinity is committing the sin of blasphemy. They also believe that Allah is all-powerful, but that at the same time he's very impersonal. We think of God as a personal God, that we can get to know God, we get to talk to God. They believe, their Quran has 99 different names for Allah, but the name Father is never used, so there's never that personal relationship. And that's definitely a contrast to what we believe and to what Jesus taught us as well, which says that God is our personal Heavenly Father. The Quran also denies that Jesus is the Son of God. Again, though, it does attribute a virgin birth to him in the same way that we hear in Luke's Gospel. But when questioned about the discrepancies between the Quran and the Bible, Muslims make the claim that the Bible is wrong because the early Christians changed it. And they claim that Jesus never died on the cross, saying instead that Allah took Jesus into heaven just before the crucifixion. And their reasoning in a way makes sense. They say that Allah would never allow one of his prophets to suffer such a demeaning death as Christians claim that Christ died, right? He suffered on the cross. But of course, as Christians, we know that Jesus willingly went to the cross and suffered on the cross because of his great love for us. So they say that Allah would not allow that to happen to one of his messengers. One of the most fundamental differences between Islam and Christianity is that Islamic law declares that each person must take care of his or her own sins. In other words, you have to earn your own salvation by following the 5 pillars of faith. And if you don't make it, if you don't earn salvation, that's on you. There's no Savior to come to your rescue. So it's a matter of sink or swim. Follow the rules or don't. And Muhammad, it's believed, designed these rules to lead his followers out of a life of idolatry and sin. But at the same time, it really places a heavy load on the person. We know, of course, that Jesus said, I'm here to save you. I came to save you. Now, I want to just, as we get ready to close here, I want to mention very quickly, there is a very distinct line drawn between the average Muslim and the more radical ones we hear about in the news. For the most part, Islam is understood to be a religion of love and compassion, tolerance, justice, but in certain areas, Islam continues to be a political religion, one whose followers believe that all society must adhere to the rules or be eliminated. And all society would mean all of us as well. We're part of society. If we don't become Muslims, then we need to be eliminated. And that means that you either adhere to Sharia law or face the consequences. And from what I understand, Sharia law is not just one set of rules, but it's a group of rules that's taken from the Quran, the Hadith, and other sources. And I want to share just a few of these rules with you. And again, this is Sharia law, not everyone follows this, but you'll notice how strict these are. Theft is punishable by amputation of the right hand. If you steal anything, your right hand is to be cut off. Criticizing or denying any part of the Quran is punishable by death. Criticizing or denying Muhammad as the prophet is punishable by death. Criticizing or denying Allah is punishable by death. And a Muslim who leaves the faith and becomes a non-Muslim is to be put to death. And a non-Muslim who leads a Muslim away from Islam, put to death. A man can marry a girl while she is an infant and then can consummate the marriage when she's only 9 years old. A woman can have one husband, but a man can have up to 4. Muhammad was allowed to have more than that. A man can unilaterally divorce his wife, but a woman needs her husband's consent in order to get a divorce. And a man can beat his wife for insubordination. This is an interesting one. Muslims should engage in taqiyya, which means that they should lie to non-Muslims in order to advance Islam. The more radical ones will follow these to the T. And that's why we hear about them in the news, right? But you should know that in Saudi Arabia, Sharia law is the law. It's enforced without mercy. And Sharia law is used in part or in full, either nationally or regionally, in many other countries as well. And I think it's difficult for us who live in a democratic society to understand the thinking behind this. But this is what those more radical Muslims believe, and they follow that without fail. And we've seen it happen in this country, right? We think of 9/11, it's because of Sharia law. But obviously, there's a lot more I could say about this. But I want to make sure that you understand that just like in any religion, there are some followers who are more radical than others. But overall, most Muslims are very peace-loving. They're very gentle people. They live in our society as we do, without trying to hurt anyone. So that's the majority of them. But there are those, right? In any religion, there are those who are more radical. any case, next week we're going to learn about Buddhism. So as we close, so let me offer a prayer. God, I just thank you for letting us learn. And perhaps it will lead us to be more compassionate, more understanding, and even more faithful to the things that you have taught us. We love you, Jesus. It's in your holy name we come.